The auditorium thrummed with life, a vibrant hum of anticipation rippling through the rows of families and friends who had gathered to honor the students' accomplishments. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers adorning the stage, and the faint rustle of programs clutched in eager hands. Laughter and chatter wove together into a symphony of celebration, the kind of moment that felt warm and timeless until it wasn't. Among the sea of faces, Thomas Carter stood like a quiet pillar, his tall frame wrapped in a crisp suit that spoke of discipline and purpose. His eyes, sharp and steady, followed his daughter Naomi as she fidgeted with the microphone, her slender fingers brushing nervously against the stand. She was 16, but in that moment, she carried the weight of her dreams with a grace that made his chest swell with pride. He rarely let slip past his guarded exterior. Naomi had spent weeks crafting her speech, her voice soft but resolute as she rehearsed under her breath, the words meant to lift the spirits of everyone in the room. Thomas could see it in her fire of ambition, tempered by a kindness she'd inherited from her mother. She was his world, a bright spark in a life shadowed by years of battling injustice as an FBI agent. He'd taught her to stand tall, to wield integrity like armor. But Naomi had added her own light to those lessons, her laughter a balm against the cynicism he'd carried too long. Today, though, was hers. She was about to step into the spotlight, and Thomas allowed himself a rare moment of stillness, savoring the sight of her on the cusp of something great. Then the world tilted. The auditorium doors crashed open with a force that shattered the hum of joy, the sound reverberating off the polished wooden floors like a gunshot. Heavy boots stomped forward, each step a deliberate intrusion, and a police officer stormed in, Officer Daniel Greer, though Thomas didn't know his name yet. The man's presence was a thundercloud rolling over a clear sky, his uniform crisp but his demeanor anything but comforting. His eyes, cold and predatory, swept the crowd, narrowing as they landed on Naomi. "You." His voice sliced through the air, sharp and accusing, a whip crack that silenced the room. "Step down now." A wave of confusion washed over the audience, murmurs rising like a tide. Naomi froze, her hands gripping the podium's edges, her breath catching in her throat. Her wide eyes darted toward her father, seeking an anchor in the sudden storm. "Excuse me?" she stammered, her voice quivering, fragile against the officer's steel. Greer didn't flinch. "You heard me," he snapped, jabbing a finger at her as if she were a fugitive caught red-handed. "You match the description of someone causing trouble. Hands up. Step down." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. His daughter a troublemaker, a criminal. The absurdity of it clashed with the reality unfolding before him, and his shock hardened into a simmering fury. He shot to his feet, his voice cutting through the stunned gasps of the crowd. "What are you talking about? She's a child." His tone trembled with disbelief, but beneath it lay a growing storm of outrage. Naomi was no threat, she was a girl with a notebook full of dreams, standing there in her best dress, her hair neatly braided, her heart open to the world. Greer ignored him, his long strides eating up the distance to the stage. His boots thudded against the steps, each one a hammer strike against Naomi's fragile courage. She tried to speak, her voice breaking as fear and humiliation coiled around her words. "I didn't do anything unjust," but before she could finish, Greer's hand clamped around her arm, yanking her from the podium with a force that sent her stumbling. Her foot caught the edge of the stage, and she nearly fell, her face flushing crimson with a mix of terror and shame. The microphone squealed as it toppled, a piercing cry that mirrored her own. Thomas lunged forward, instinct overriding reason, but Greer spun to face him, his hand hovering over the holster at his hip. "Back off, sir," he snarled, his lips curling with contempt. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The threat hung heavy, a loaded promise that stopped Thomas in his tracks, his fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms as he fought the urge to charge. "You have no right to treat her this way," he roared, his voice cracking with anguish. "She's done nothing wrong." Greer's eyes glinted with something dark, unyielding. "You people always play the victim," he sneered, his words dripping with venom. "Maybe it's time someone taught you accountability." The insult landed like a slap, but it was the sight of Naomi tears streaming down her face as Greer dragged her off the stage that broke something inside Thomas. Her protests, small and pleading, echoed in his ears, drowned out by the officer's relentless grip. The audience sat in paralyzed silence, their faces a gallery of shock and helplessness. A teacher, Mrs. Hargrove, stepped forward, her graying hair framing a face etched with worry. She'd known Naomi since she was a shy third grader, had watched her bloom into the fierce, compassionate girl she was now. "Please, stop," she cried, her voice trembling but firm. "This is a misunderstanding's not who you're looking for." Greer barely spared her a glance, waving her off with a dismissive flick of his hand. "Stay out of this, or you're next," he growled, his tone laced with a menace that made her recoil. Thomas's heart thundered in his chest as he watched Greer cuff Naomi's wrists, her slender frame trembling beneath the cold metal. She looked so small, so fragile, as he marched her toward the exit. Her head bowed under the weight of a humiliation she didn't deserve. The auditorium, once a place of triumph, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in around Thomas's rage and despair. He'd spent his career fighting for justice, staring down corruption and cruelty. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the raw, searing pain of watching his daughter suffer at the hands of a man who wielded power like a blunt weapon. Outside, the patrol car loomed in the afternoon light, its flashing lights casting harsh shadows across the school lawn. Greer shoved Naomi into the back seat, her sobs muffled by the closing door. Thomas followed, his steps heavy, his mind a whirlwind of fury and calculation. He wanted to tear the officer apart, to demand answers, to shield Naomi from the nightmare unfolding around her. But he knew brute force wouldn't undo this, it would only tighten the noose. So he stood there, fists balled, jaw locked, as Greer turned to him with a final taunt. "Maybe next time you'll teach her to respect authority," the officer sneered, his arrogance a blade twisting in Thomas's gut. He slammed the car door shut, the sound a punctuation mark on his cruelty, and strode toward the driver's seat without a backward glance. To him, this was routine, a flex of power, a lesson delivered. But he didn't know who he'd just crossed. Thomas didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was a mask, concealing the tempest raging within. Behind his unreadable expression, a plan was taking shape, fueled by a father's love and a warrior's resolve. Greer saw a helpless parent. He didn't see the man who'd spent decades dismantling systems of abuse, who knew the law's every crevice, who had connections that reached far beyond this small-town precinct. Thomas Carter wasn't just Naomi's father, was a force, a reckoning waiting to unfurl. As the patrol car pulled away, Naomi's tear-streaked face pressed against the window. Thomas made a vow, this wouldn't end here. Justice wasn't just a word to him, it was a promise, etched into every fiber of his being. Greer had lit a match, oblivious to the inferno he'd ignited. The lesson here wasn't about accountability for Naomi, it was about the consequences of power misused, of innocence trampled. And Thomas would ensure that lesson was learned, not just by Greer, but by anyone who dared to forget that righteousness could strike back with a fury all its own. The crowd lingered in the auditorium, whispers replacing the earlier joy. Mrs. Hargrove wrung her hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she replayed Naomi's frightened expression in her mind. She'd failed to protect her student, and the guilt gnawed at her. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, their celebration soured by the bitter taste of reality. For Thomas, though, the story was far from over. The wheels were already turning, and the tables would turn in ways Greer could never foresee. In the clash between a father's love and a tyrant's arrogance, only one would stand when the dust settled, and Thomas knew it wouldn't be the man who dared to break his daughter's spirit. The moment Officer Greer stepped into the room, a ripple of unease coursed through Thomas's veins, sharp and insistent, like a predator's scent cutting through the air. Greer's piercing gaze swept across the crowd, his posture radiating a confidence that teetered dangerously close to outright arrogance. His heavy boots struck the polished wooden floor with deliberate force, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the suddenly hushed space. This wasn't a man here to join the celebration, this was a hunter, stalking prey with a purpose Thomas couldn't yet discern. The festive hum of the school event dulled under the weight of Greer's presence, the laughter and chatter fading as if smothered by an unseen hand. At the edge of the stage, Naomi lingered, her hands nervously smoothing the hem of her dress. She'd been waiting her turn to speak, her eyes bright with anticipation just moments ago. Now, as Greer's shadow loomed closer, her brow creased with confusion, her head tilting slightly toward the growing disturbance. Thomas watched her, his chest tightening. She didn't deserve this, whatever this was. His eyes narrowed as Greer strode down the aisle, the officer's voice slicing through the stillness like a blade. "Excuse me," Greer barked, loud enough to make the room flinch. "I'm looking for someone." His tone carried no request, only command. The principal, a weary woman with gray-streaked hair and a practiced smile, stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She'd spent weeks planning this event, pouring her heart into every detail, and now her carefully curated joy was unraveling. "Officer," she said, her voice wavering as her smile flickered, "this is a private school gathering. Can I assist you with something?" Her words hung in the air, polite but fragile, a plea for civility. Greer didn't even glance her way, his eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto Naomi. "You," he said, jabbing a finger in her direction. "Step down." Naomi's body stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Her wide eyes darted from Greer to the crowd, then back again, searching for an explanation that wasn't coming. What?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Greer's patience snapped like a brittle twig. "You heard me," he growled, his lips curling with irritation. "Get off the stage." Now, the command hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she couldn't move, her feet rooted to the spot as fear and bewilderment battled within her. Thomas was already rising from his seat, his movements fluid, but charged with a quiet fury. His heart pounded against his ribs, a steady rhythm of rage he fought to contain. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel, a tone he'd perfected over years of facing down men far more dangerous than Greer. The officer turned to him, his expression hardening into something almost feral. "Who are you?" Greer demanded, his hand shifting subtly toward the baton at his waist, a silent threat. Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "I'm her father," he replied, each word deliberate, weighted with authority, "and I'd like to know why you're disrupting this event." Greer's eyes flicked to Naomi, then back to Thomas, sizing him up. "She matches the description of a suspect we're looking for," he said, his voice flat, mechanical, as if that alone justified everything. "I need to take her in for questioning." Thomas took a step forward, his broad frame filling the space between them, his presence a wall Greer couldn't easily push past. "That's absurd," he said, his tone low but firm. "She's a student, not a suspect. If you think you can just barge in here," and Greer cut him off, his hand now resting fully on the baton. "Back off," he snapped. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." From the stage, Naomi's voice broke through, trembling yet defiant, a spark of her usual fire shining through her fear. "I didn't do anything," she said, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "I don't even know what this is about." Greer's eyes narrowed, his contempt palpable. "I don't need your attitude, girl," he spat, the word dripping with disdain, a venom that stung deeper than she'd expected. Thomas's fists clenched, his knuckles whitening as a wave of anger surged through him. Hot and unrelenting. "That's enough," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're out of line." But Greer wasn't listening. In one swift motion, he grabbed Naomi's arm, yanking her toward him with a force that made her stumble. The room erupted in chaos, parents gasping, teachers shouting, their voices a cacophony of outrage and disbelief. Naomi's face flushed red, a mix of terror and humiliation washing over her as she tried to pull away. "Stop," she cried, her voice cracking. "You're hurting me." Thomas lunged forward, every instinct screaming at him to tear Greer apart. But the officer stepped back, his hand now hovering over his holstered gun. "Stay where you are," Greer warned, his tone icy, his eyes daring Thomas to test him. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Thomas's mind raced, a storm of emotions colliding within him, fear, and a bone-deep helplessness he hadn't felt in years. He knew the stakes all too well. He'd seen situations like this spiral out of control, ending in blood and regret. One wrong move, and this could turn deadly. Naomi's eyes met his, wide and pleading. "Dad, Please, she whispered, her voice a dagger to his soul. It took every ounce of his willpower to stay still as Greer dragged her toward the exit, her small frame struggling against his grip. Thomas stood frozen, his body trembling with a rage he couldn't unleash. Not here, not yet. But as the door swung shut behind them, he made a silent vow. This was far from over. The drive home was suffocating, the silence between Thomas and Naomi thick with unspoken pain. She sat slumped in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face turned toward the window. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her features, illuminating the tension in her jaw, the way her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the school, her usual spark dimmed by a quiet, seething hurt. Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, his eyes flicking to her every few seconds. He wanted to say something, anything, bridge the gap, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, a sensation that gnawed at him like a relentless beast. When they pulled into the driveway, Naomi didn't wait for the engine to die. She flung the door open and stormed out, her steps quick and unsteady, fueled by a fury she couldn't contain. The front door slammed behind her with a force that rattled the frame, leaving Thomas alone in the car for a moment, staring at the empty space she'd left behind. He followed her inside, his heart heavy, and found her in the living room. Her backpack hit the floor with a dull thud, and she whirled to face him, her eyes blazing with tears she refused to let fall. "Why didn't you stop him, Dad?" she demanded, her voice breaking under the weight of her frustration. "You just stood there and let him treat me like a criminal." Her words grew louder, sharper. "As the dam broke, that's what I looked like to everyone in that room, a criminal. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Thomas raised his hands, a gesture of peace, though his own anger simmered just beneath the surface. "Naomi, you don't think I wanted to do something," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You don't think I was ready to tear him apart for touching you. But I had to stay in control for you." Her eyes flashed with hurt, her breath hitching. "Control?" She shot back. "You call letting him drag me out of their control?" Thomas stepped closer, his tone firming as he fought to keep his composure. "Naomi, listen to me. If I'd lost Ida, if I'd made one wrong move, Ado, you know what could have happened. It wasn't just about keeping you safe. It was about keeping us alive." Her shoulders sagged slightly, but her jaw remained tight, her defiance unshaken. She swiped at her face with a quick, angry motion, as if erasing her vulnerability would erase the pain. "So what now, Dad?" she asked, her voice quieter but no less bitter. "We just let him get away with it. Let him think he can do that to Meadow, anyone?" Thomas's expression darkened, his resolve hardening like steel. "We're not letting anything go," he said, his voice softening but carrying a promise. "There's a way to handle this, Naomi, a way to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else again." She scoffed, turning away, her arms crossing tighter. "You mean filing a complaint, writing a letter, like that's going to do anything?" Thomas's face tightened, a flicker of something dangerous passing through his eyes. "I'm not talking about complaints," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "I'm talking about justice." She turned back to him, her brow furrowing as she searched his face. "What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Thomas hesitated, then moved to the couch, sinking into it with a heavy sigh. He rubbed his hands together, the friction grounding him as he gathered his thoughts. "There's a lot about what I do that I've never shared with you," he began, his voice low, steady, but laced with a gravity that made her pause. "Not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to protect you. But after today, I think it's time you know who I really am." Naomi frowned, her confusion deepening. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. "I'm not just an FBI agent, Naomi. I've spent most of my career working undercover, taking down organized crime, rooting out corruption. I've seen men like Greer before me who think they're untouchable because they hide behind a badge. But I know how to expose them, and I'm going to do it." Her eyes widened, a mix of shock and curiosity flickering across her face. "You're serious?" she whispered. "Dead serious," Thomas replied, his voice unwavering. "That man didn't just humiliate you. He crossed a line, and he's going to pay for it." The determination in his words ignited something in Naomi, a faint spark of hope, piercing through the haze of her anger and shame. "But how?" she asked, her voice softer now, tentative. "How do we even start?" Thomas leaned back, his expression turning thoughtful, calculating. "First, we gather information," he said. "I need to know everything about him, his history, his connections, his weaknesses. If there's dirt on him, I'll find it. And if there isn't, I'll make sure the world sees the kind of man he really is." Naomi hesitated, her mind racing. And if he doesn't have any weaknesses? What if he really is untouchable? A small, almost predatory smile curved Thomas's lips, a glint of something fierce in his eyes. "Everyone has weaknesses, Naomi," he said quietly. "You just have to know where to look." Over the next few days, their home transformed into a battleground of strategy and resolve. Thomas worked late into the night, his desk littered with files and notes, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his focused expression. He made hushed phone calls to old contacts, piecing together Greer's past with a precision that spoke of years spent unraveling the darkest corners of human nature. Naomi watched him, her doubts slowly giving way to a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice, a lesson in the consequences of wielding power without accountability. And as the days stretched on, she began to believe they might actually win. Naomi had always harbored a quiet skepticism about her father's world, a place shadowed by secrets she could never quite grasp as a child. But now, as she stood on the precipice of his grand scheme, something shifted deep within her. She felt a pull, an irresistible tide drawing her into his plans, and she threw herself into the effort with a fervor she hadn't known she possessed. Each task she undertook, whether it was sifting through old records or piecing together cryptic leads, felt like peeling back layers of the man who had raised her. No longer was he just the steady figure who'd tucked her in at night or taught her to ride a bike. Now, she saw him as a warrior, weathered by battles fought in silence, struggles so vast and hidden that most people lived their entire lives oblivious to their existence. The revelation stirred a cocktail of emotions, and her pride swelled in her chest, but it mingled with an ache, a longing to have understood him sooner. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Greer carried on as though the world still turned in his favor. Each morning, he laced up his polished boots, adjusted his badge with a practiced flick, and stepped into the sunlit streets with the same swagger that had carried him through years of unchallenged authority. His patrols were a performance, a display of arrogance so thick it seemed to radiate from him like heat off asphalt. He smirked at shopkeepers, barked orders at rookies, and reveled in the belief that he was untouchable, a king in his own petty empire. But beneath that polished exterior, the first fissures were forming. Whispers slithered through the precinct, soft at first, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze, but growing louder with each passing day. Colleagues who once laughed at his crude jokes now exchanged sidelong glances. Questions bubbled up about complaints that had vanished into thin air, about reports that didn't add up, about the shadow that seemed to trail him wherever he went. Anonymous tips began flooding in, each one a pinprick in his armor, pointing to inconsistencies he couldn't dismiss, patterns of brutality, late-night meetings, and money that appeared from nowhere. At first, Greer waved it off with a scoff, chalking it up to petty jealousy or coincidence. But as the weeks dragged on, the weight of scrutiny pressed down on him. His supervisors summoned him into sterile offices, their voices clipped and their eyes cold. His partner, a weary man named Jenkins, who'd once shadowed him like a loyal dog, now kept a wary distance, his silence louder than any accusation. Even the desk sergeants and dispatcherships, who'd long ignored his excesses, began watching him with narrowed eyes, their chatter dying down whenever he entered the room. From the edges of this unraveling drama, Thomas observed it all with the patience of a predator stalking prey. He stood in the quiet of his dimly lit office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and ink. Papers sprawled across his desk like a battlefield map, each scribbled note and highlighted line a thread in the intricate web he was weaving. This wasn't just a vendetta, it was a crusade. Thomas didn't merely want to topple Greer, aimed to dismantle the rotten machinery that had propped up men like him for far too long. Justice, he believed, wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about exposing the systems that let them flourish. The silent agreements that traded power for silence. Every move he made was deliberate, every piece of evidence a brick in the foundation of his plan. Yet he knew this was only the opening act. The stakes were climbing, and the deeper he dug, the more treacherous the path became. Naomi felt the tension coiling around them like a storm cloud ready to burst. She stood in the doorway of her father's office one evening, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched him hunched over his desk. The faint glow of a lamp illuminated the lines etched into his face lines. She'd once thought were from laughter, but now realized were carved by years of resolve. Fear gnawed at her, a cold knot in her stomach that whispered warnings of danger. But alongside it burned a fierce admiration, a flame that grew brighter with every glimpse of her father's unshakable will. She'd always known he was strong, his hands steady when he'd bandaged her scraped knees, his voice calm when storms rattled their old house. But this was a different kind of strength. It was raw, unrelenting, almost mythic. As she watched him connect the dots of Greer's corruption, a fragile hope took root in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could triumph over the Goliath they faced. Yet that hope was tempered by a creeping dread. Greer wasn't just a thug with a gun and a badge, was a man with secrets, dark and tangled, and he'd guard them with a ferocity that could destroy them all. The office felt like a pressure cooker, its walls closing in as Thomas's mind raced. The single bulb overhead flickered faintly, casting jagged shadows across the chaos of his workspace. Stacks of files teetered precariously, their edges curling from hours of handling, while sticky notes dotted the desk like constellations, each one marking a connection to Officer Daniel Greer. Over the past week, Thomas had built a portrait of the man that was as damning as it was terrifying. Excessive force complaints stretched back years, buried under layers of bureaucratic neglect. There were whispers of late-night rendezvous with local gang enforcers, their handshakes to firm, their smiles to knowing. And then there were the bank-record untraceable deposits that appeared like ghosts, hinting at a corruption so deep it sent chills down Thomas's spine. The evidence wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a cannon, primed and ready to blow Greer's world apart. But one piece remained elusive, a keystone locked away in the precinct's internal database, beyond his remote reach. Naomi stepped into the room, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. Her eyes swept over the center, her father's slumped shoulders, the empty coffee mugs, the faint tremor in his hands from too many sleepless nights. "You've been up all night again," she said, her voice gentle but laced with worry. She lingered near the desk, her fingers brushing the edge of a file as she studied him. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Thomas lifted his gaze, his face gaunt but alight with a fire that refused to dim. "Almost," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion but steady with purpose. "There's one more thing I need. It's in the precinct system. I can't get it from here." Her brow furrowed, a storm of concern flashing in her dark eyes. "You're not seriously thinking about going there, are you? That's insane, Dad. If he catches you," Thomas cut her off, his tone sharp but not unkind. "And if I don't, everything we've done could collapse. Greer isn't just a bad apple, Naomi. He's a cog in something massive. I need proof." She hesitated, her fists balling at her sides as a war raged within her. She wanted to scream at him, to drag him away from this madness. But she also felt the pull of his mission that had become hers too. "Let me help you," she pleaded, her voice trembling with a mix of defiance and desperation. "You can't do this alone." Thomas's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "No," he said firmly, then gentled his tone. "I need you here, Naomi. If this goes wrong, I can't have you near it." She stepped closer, her breath catching as emotion spilled over. "I can't just sit here and wait, Dad. Not after what he did to me. I need to see him pay. I need to see him fall." Thomas rested a hand on her shoulder, his grip a lifeline in the chaos. "You will," he said, his voice steady as stone. "But trust Mathis is what I do. Let me handle it." Reluctantly, she nodded, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears and a fear she couldn't shake. "Promise me you'll be careful," she whispered. "I promise," he replied. But the heaviness in his words betrayed the calculations already spinning in his mind. Later that night, Thomas sat in his car, parked in a shadowed corner near the precinct. The building loomed before him, its brick facade bathed in the sickly glow of fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly in the stillness. The dashboard clock ticked past midnight, the late hour cloaking the world in an uneasy quiet. He knew the shift change was his window, a brief lapse when the station would be a skeleton crew. Just enough distraction to slip through the cracks. Slipping out of the car, he moved like a phantom, his breath shallow and deliberate. Years of undercover work had honed his instincts. He knew how to melt into the darkness, how to make his footsteps silent against the pavement. The precinct's front desk was a formality he bypassed with ease, ducking down a side corridor as the lone clerk yawned over a magazine. The records room was his target, its door a silent sentinel locked against intruders. With a small toolkit tucked in his jacket, he knelt before it, his fingers deft and sure as they coaxed the tumblers into submission. The click of the lock was a small victory, a rush of adrenaline that steadied his nerves. Inside, the room was a maze of cabinets and glowing computer screens, the air humming with the faint whine of machinery. He logged in with stolen credentials, his heart hammering as the system blinked to life. Files flashed across the screen, reports, logs, Mimosal downloading onto a drive small enough to fit in his palm. The sound of boots echoing in the hall snapped him to attention. He shut the laptop with a soft click and ducked behind a row of cabinets. His breath held tight in his chest. The door creaked open, and a flashlight beam sliced through the darkness. "Thought I heard something," a gruff voice muttered. Officer Jenkins, Greer's skittish partner, his silhouette framed in the doorway. The light swept inches from Thomas's hiding spot, and he pressed himself flatter against the cold metal, willing his heartbeat to slow. Jenkins lingered, his hesitation palpable, before finally turning away with a shrug. Thomas exhaled, the sound barely a whisper, and waited until the footsteps faded before slipping out, the drive a heavy promise in his pocket. By the time he slid back into his car, the gravity of his actions settled over him like a shroud. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about survival. Back home, Naomi paced the living room, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to call him. When the door finally opened, her face lit up with relief, though her hands trembled as she rushed to his side. "Did you get it?" she asked, her voice bright with hope. Thomas nodded, handing her the drive as exhaustion carved deeper lines into his features. "It's all here," he said. "Everything we need to bury him." They sat together at the kitchen table, the laptop casting a harsh glow over their faces as they scrolled through the files. What they found wasn't just incriminating, it was earth-shattering. Greer wasn't a lone wolf. He was a linchpin in a sprawling network of criminals, trading secrets and resources to shield their empire. The implications stretched far beyond the precinct, into the city's underbelly and up its gleaming towers. Naomi's voice shook as she spoke, her eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't just about him. It's the whole system. How do we even fight something this big?" Thomas's jaw tightened, his resolve a steel thread running through him. "We expose it, all of it, and we start with him." The next morning, Thomas reached out to a journalist he trusted, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena who'd spent years chasing stories others feared to touch. The files went to her anonymously, bundled with a meticulous account of Greer's sins. Within hours, the story broke like a dam bursting, first a trickle in the local papers, then a flood across national headlines. Public outrage erupted, a chorus of voices demanding answers. But Greer wasn't one to go quietly. As the walls closed in, his desperation turned him into a cornered animal. He lashed out at colleagues, his voice a snarl as he dismissed the accusations as lies. Then, one humid evening, he showed up at Thomas's doorstep, unannounced and unhinged. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot with fury as he jabbed a finger at Thomas. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he sneered, his breath sour with whiskey. "Leaking your little fairy tales to the press. You have no idea who you're screwing with." Thomas stood firm, his stance unshaken, his voice a blade of calm. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, and now everyone else does too." Greer stepped closer, his whisper dripping with venom. "You've made a mistake, Carter. People like you don't fall. We don't lose." Thomas didn't blink. "That's where you're wrong, because people like you don't stop." Greer stormed off into the night, his footsteps heavy with rage. But Naomi caught the exchange from the doorway. She stepped outside, her face a mask of awe and unease as she looked at her father. "You're not afraid of him, are you?" she asked, her voice soft but searching. Thomas turned to her, his expression softening into something tender yet fierce. "I'm afraid of what happens if we don't finish this," he admitted. "But fear doesn't get to win. Not this time." The stage was set, and Greer was unraveling his allies, scattering like rats from a sinking ship. As the evidence piled higher, yet Thomas knew the war wasn't won. The system that had cradled Greer's corruption still stood, its roots deep and twisted. Justice wasn't just about toppling one man. It was about confronting the consequences of unchecked power, a lesson etched into every move they made. For Naomi, it was a revelation of her father's strength, of the cost of righteousness, and of the fragile hope that truth could prevail. In the depths of a frigid night, the wind howled relentlessly through the desolate outskirts of town, slicing through the empty lots surrounding an abandoned warehouse. The air was heavy with an electric tension, as though nature itself sensed the confrontation brewing within those crumbling walls. Thomas Carter stood just outside the rusted, creaking metal door, his breath visible in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. His fingers tightened around the small recorder nestled in his coat pocket, a lifeline of truth in a world drowning in lies. His heart thundered in his chest, a relentless drumbeat echoing his resolve as he steeled himself for what lay ahead. Across the cavernous room, bathed in the faint, sickly light of a single overhead bulb, stood Greer, a towering figure whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of his arrogance. His lips twisted into a mocking smirk, a predator sizing up prey he assumed was already defeated. For years, men like Greer had reigned unchallenged, their power a suffocating shadow over the town. Thomas had long understood that toppling such a deeply entrenched system would demand more than a single triumph. Yet tonight felt different. It wasn't just another skirmish, it was the culmination of a war he'd waged in silence, fueled by a tip from one of his old contacts. That whisper of hope had led him here, to this forsaken place, where a final, undeniable piece of evidence lay hidden in plain sight, poised to shatter Greer's empire of corruption. As Thomas stepped forward, the cracked concrete floor crunching beneath his boots, he couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that this was the moment everything would either collapse into chaos or snap into place with a clarity no one could have foreseen. Greer's voice sliced through the stillness, thick with sarcasm and venom. Well, Carter, I was starting to wonder when you'd crawl out of your hole." His tone dripped with disdain, but beneath it simmered a flicker of unease he couldn't fully mask. Thomas stopped a few feet away, his posture unwavering, his eyes locked on the man who had haunted his nightmares for too long. "I think we both know why I'm here," he replied, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. Greer let out a low, guttural chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by a child's naivety. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this little crusade of yours, it's pointless. You've been kicking up dust, Carter, but dust doesn't topple men like me." Thomas tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening as he studied the man before him. "It's not just dust, Greer, it's the truth. And the thing about the truth is, no matter how deep you bury it, it always claws its way back to the surface." For a fleeting moment, Greer's smirk wavered, a crack in his iron facade, though he quickly masked it with a scoff. "You think you've got me all figured out, don't you? Some self-righteous avenger taking down the big, bad cop." He took a menacing step closer, his voice dropping to a hiss that sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "But you're in my territory now, Carter, and in my world, people like you don't survive." Unfazed, Thomas held his ground, his expression a mask of quiet determination. "Is that what you tell yourself, that you're untouchable? The evidence begs to differ." Greer's jaw clenched, and for the first time, a shadow of doubt flickered in his cold, calculating eyes. "What evidence?" he snapped, his tone laced with defiance. "The scraps you've been feeding the press. It's flimsy at best, circumstantial garbage." A faint, knowing smile tugged at Thomas's lips, a spark of triumph he couldn't suppress. "Not all of it. You've been sloppy, Greer. You left a trail, and I've finally found the piece that ties it all together." Greer's composure fractured, his voice rising with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're bluffing." Thomas reached into his pocket, pulling out a folder he'd brought as a decoy, a prop in this deadly game of wits. He held it aloft, watching as Greer's gaze darted to the papers, hunger and fear warring in his expression. "This," Thomas said, his voice calm but resolute, "is everything. Every name you've strong-armed, every dirty deal you've brokered, every lie you've spun to keep your throne. And it's not just you, it's every lackey who propped you up along the way." Greer's breathing grew ragged, his fists balling at his sides as the weight of Thomas's words bore down on him. "You think you can waltz in here and threaten me?" he snarled. "Do you have any idea what I'm capable of?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, simmering fury that seemed to fill the room. "You've done enough already. You humiliated my daughter, twisted your badge into a weapon, and thought you'd walk away unscathed. But this time, you picked the wrong family to cross." Greer's face contorted into a sneer, his laughter sharp and cruel. "Family, huh? That's what this is about. Your precious little girl." He spat the words like venom, his eyes glinting with malice. "She's nothing, Carter, just another nobody. When this is over, no one's going to give a damn about her." For a heartbeat, Thomas's control slipped, his hands trembling with the urge to lash out. The image of his daughter, her tear-streaked face, her broken trust flashed through his mind, stoking a fire he'd fought to keep contained. But he forced himself to breathe, to channel that rage into something sharper, something unstoppable. "You're wrong," he said, his voice quiet but piercing. "People will remember her, and they'll remember Yunit as the untouchable kingpin you think you are, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when power rots from within." In a sudden burst of fury, Greer lunged forward, snatching the folder from Thomas's grasp. He tore it open with frantic hands, his eyes scanning the page suddenly to find them blank. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he roared, "There's nothing here." Thomas met his glare with an unshakable calm. "That's right, because the real evidence is already on its way to the Attorney General." Greer froze, the color draining from his face as the implications sank in. "You're lying," he whispered, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his crumbling certainty. "Test me," Thomas replied, pulling the recorder from his pocket and pressing play. The room filled with Greer's own voicey arrogant, unfiltered spilling confessions from a meeting Thomas had secretly captured weeks earlier. Each word was a nail in the coffin of Greer's empire. Backroom deals, threats, admissions of crimes no badge could excuse. As the recording ended, Greer's face twisted into a mask of rage and desperation. "You think this'll bring me down?" he spat. "I'll deny it all. They'll believe me over you, a washed-up nobody with a grudge." Thomas advanced, his voice a quiet, unyielding force. "Maybe they would have a few weeks ago. But now reporters are tearing into your past. Your so-called allies are scrambling to save themselves. The evidence is stacking up. Greer, your reign's over." For a moment, Greer stood motionless, his chest heaving as he wrestled with the collapse of his world. Then, in a flash of desperation, he reached for his gun, his hand shaking as he aimed it at Thomas. "You don't walk out of here," he growled, his voice raw with panic. Thomas didn't flinch, his gaze locked on Greer's. "Think it through. Pull that trigger, and you'll prove every word I've said. You'll bury yourself deeper than I ever could." Greer's hand trembled, the barrel wavering as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the suffocating tension of a man staring down his own demise. Thomas stood firm, his resolve a silent challenge, daring Greer to cross the line from which there'd be no return. Then, faintly at first, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing louder as sirens pierced the night. Greer's head snapped toward the door, panic flashing across his face like a cornered animal. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Thomas's response was simple, almost serene. "I called in backup. You didn't think I'd face you alone, did you?" Before Greer could react, the door burst open and federal agents stormed in, their shouts ringing out as they surrounded him. His gun clattered to the floor, his defiance crumbling into a hollow shell as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "You're finished, Greer," Thomas said, his voice cold and final. "It's over." As the agents dragged Greer away, his head bowed in defeat. Thomas felt a wave of relief crash over him, washing away months of sleepless nights and gnawing doubt. He turned to leave, but paused as a familiar figure stepped into the dim light. "Naomi," his daughter. Her eyes, wide with a mix of awe and gratitude, met his. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "We did it," he corrected, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself exhale, the burden lifting from his shoulders. Outside, the night was alive with the pulsing red and blue of police lights, casting stark shadows across the lot. Thomas and Naomi stood together, their silhouettes framed against the chaos, their bond forged anew in the crucible of this fight. The battle had ended, but the war for justice stretched on an unending pursuit of a world where power answered to truth. Greer's arrest sent shockwaves rippling far beyond the warehouse, igniting a firestorm of outrage and reckoning. News vans descended like vultures, their cameras capturing every angle of a story that laid bare the rot of corruption, the agony of its victims, and the failures of a system that had shielded men like Greer for too long. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky in hesitant streaks of gold, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the weight of the night settling into his bones. His laptop glowed with headlines and videos, each one recounting the fall of Greer in vivid detail. Yet none could capture the raw, visceral truth of what he'd endured sleepless hours. The fear for Naomi, the quiet fury that had driven him to this point. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion seeping in where adrenaline had once burned. Across from him, Naomi cradled a mug of coffee, her eyes tracing the flood of articles. "They're calling you a hero," she said softly, glancing up with a faint smile. Thomas met her gaze, a weary warmth in his expression. "I didn't do it for that." She set her mug down, her voice steady. "I know. But to Themdometh, that's what you are." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let her words settle over him. "It's not over yet," he said, his tone heavy with the knowledge of battles still to come. Naomi nodded, her eyes reflecting the same quiet strength he'd seen in himself the night before. Greer had been a symptom, not the disease, a single thread in a tapestry of corruption that stretched far beyond one man. But in that moment, as father and daughter sat together in the fragile light of a new day, they knew they'd struck a blow for justice, and in its wake, they'd sown a lesson for all to heed. Power, when wielded without accountability, would inevitably face its reckoning. The air in the cramped kitchen was heavy with the scent of brewed coffee, and unspoken tension as Naomi sat across from Thomas, her fingers absently tracing the chipped rim of her mug, her brow furrowed slightly, her dark eyes reflecting a storm of thoughts she didn't voice aloud. She nodded slowly, her lips parting as if to speak before she settled on a quiet hum of agreement. "You've rattled the cage, Thomas," she said at last, her voice soft yet laced with a cautious hope. "People are starting to noticeably notice. That's not nothing. It's a spark, isn't it?" Her words hung between them, fragile but weighty, like the first crack of dawn piercing a long night. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the wooden frame creaking under his shifting weight. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, betraying the exhaustion he tried to mask with a steady gaze. "It's something," he admitted, his tone gravelly but firm, "but it's a double-edged sword. Shining a light on this mess doesn't just expose the roti, stirs up the hornet's nest. There are folks out there who'd rather bury this truth 6 feet under than let it breathe. Powerful folks, dangerous ones." His words settled into the silence like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling outward, carrying fears neither of them dared to name. He rubbed a hand over his stubbled jaw, his mind already racing ahead, plotting paths through a labyrinth of risks he couldn't yet map. Naomi's frown deepened, her fingers tightening around the mug as if it could anchor her against the rising tide of unease. The steam curled upward, catching the dim light of the overhead bulb, and for a moment, she seemed lost in its dance. "So where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet with a sharpness born of determination. She leaned forward, her elbows pressing into the worn tabletop, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Thomas pause. He exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of every decision he'd made thus far. "We keep moving," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We dig deeper, turn over every stone, chase down every name until there's nothing left to hide. But we do it smart, Naomi, only careful step at a time. No reckless leaps." His gaze softened as he studied her. the lines around his eyes deepening with a mix of pride and worry. Naomi's posture stiffened, her chin lifting as a spark of defiance flared in her chest. "I'm in this with you," she said, her tone unwavering. "I've been here since the start. Dad, you don't get to sideline me now." Her words were a challenge, but beneath them lay a plea, a desperate need to stand beside him in this fight. She'd seen too much, felt too much, to let him shoulder it alone. Thomas hesitated, his heart twisting in the familiar tug-of-war between shielding her and trusting her. The instinct to protect roared within him, urging him to wrap her in safety and push her far from the shadows they were chasing. But then he saw the steel in her eyes, the same unyielding resolve he'd seen in himself years ago, and his resistance crumbled. "All right," he said finally, his voice softening with reluctant acceptance. "But we're a team, no solo heroics, no risks without a plan, got it?" Her face broke into a smile, relief flooding her features like sunlight after a storm. "Deal," she replied, her voice lighter now, though the gravity of their pact lingered in the air. The days that followed spun into a chaotic blur, a whirlwind of motion that left little room for doubt or rest. Greer's arrest had cracked open a dam, unleashing a flood of scrutiny within the department. Internal investigations sprouted like weeds, each one unearthing fresh tendrils of corruption that stretched far beyond the disgraced officer. Whistleblowers, some trembling with fear, others burning with righteous anger, stepped into the light, their voices weaving a tapestry of betrayal that shocked even the most jaded observers. The city pulsed with outrage, streets alive with the chants of protesters and the flicker of news cameras, their lenses hungry for the next revelation. Justice, it seemed, was waking from a long slumber, but its awakening came at a cost. For Thomas, the rising tide of attention brought not just hope but a creeping dread. Late one evening, as he sat hunched over a cluttered desk, the glow of his laptop casting harsh shadows across his face, his phone buzzed against the wood. He reached for it, his brow furrowing at the unknown number flashing on the screen. "Hello?" He answered, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. A low, guttural voice slithered through the line, cold and deliberate. "You think you've won. Carter, you think you've got this all figured out? You're digging in dirt deeper than you can handle. Walk away now, or you'll wish you had." The words dripped with menace, each syllable a dagger aimed at his resolve. A laugh followed, sharp, hollow, and utterly devoid of warmth before the line went dead, leaving Thomas clutching the phone, his knuckles whitening. His mind churned, the threat sinking into his bones like a chill he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about Greer anymore. This was a beast with many heads, and he'd only begun to glimpse its scale. Naomi's footsteps broke his reverie as she entered the room, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his thoughts. She stopped short, her sharp eyes catching the tension etched into his features. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern as she crossed the threshold. He set the phone down with deliberate calm, schooling his expression into something neutral. Though the effort felt hollow. "Nothing," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just some crank call. Happens all the time." She studied him, her arms crossing as her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're a terrible liar." "Dad," she said, her tone sharp but laced with worry. "If they're coming after you, it's not nothing." Thomas sighed, dragging a hand through his graying hair, the weight of her gaze pulling the truth from him. "Someone's trying to scare us off," he admitted, his voice steady but heavy. "It's not the first time, Naomi, and it won't be the last. But I'm not backing down. The don't get to win by intimidation." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of fear warring with the fire of her resolve. "Then we don't let them," she said firmly, stepping closer. "But you've got to promise me you'll be careful. No playing the invincible hero." "I promise," he replied, though the words felt brittle against the growing unease gnawing at his gut. He wanted to believe he could shield her from the fallout, but the deeper they waded into this mire, the less certain he became. Weeks bled into one another, each day stacking evidence against Greer and his tangled network of allies. Depositions piled up, charges took root, and the once ironclad system began to fracture under the pressure. Yet with every triumph, new shadows loomed, faceless enemies whispering threats from the dark. Thomas wrestled with the toll of it all, his nights spent poring over files, his mind haunted by the faces of those ensnared in the corruption. Some were hardened criminals, their souls long surrendered to greed. Others were broken South's public servants twisted by desperation or blackmail into betraying their oaths. The line between villain and victim blurred, and with it, Thomas's own certainty wavered. Was he dismantling a monster or merely pruning its branches? One sleepless night, as he sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of his choices pressing against his chest, Naomi appeared in the doorway. She lingered there, her silhouette framed by the faint hallway light, watching him with a quiet intensity. "You're carrying this alone again, aren't you?" she said, her voice gentle but piercing. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "It's my fight, Naomi. I dragged us into this." She stepped inside, her movements deliberate as she crossed the room and sank into the chair across from him. "You don't have to finish it by yourself," she countered, her tone firm yet tender. "We're partners in this, remember?" Her words stirred a warmth in him, a lifeline amid the chaos. "I haven't forgotten," he said softly, leaning forward. "So what's next?" Her gaze held his, steady and unyielding. "We keep pushing," she replied. "We see it through, no matter what." Earlier that day, Thomas had sat in the stark conference room of the FBI field office, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and tension. Across from him, Agent Rivera, his colleague of a decade, a man with a quick laugh and a quicker mind flip through the dossier. Thomas had painstakingly assembled. The evidence sprawled across the table, photographs, transcripts, bank recordsal threads in a web that bound Greer to a sprawling network of corruption. Rivera's fingers paused on a page, his brow creasing as he absorbed the scope of it all. "This is massive," he said at last, his voice low and strained. He leaned back, rubbing his temples as if to ease the headache brewing behind his eyes. "Bigger than you might even realize, Thomas. Greer wasn't just a bad apple, was the keystone holding this whole rotten structure together." Thomas nodded, his expression carved from stone. "I've got a sense of how far it reaches," he said, his voice a quiet growl. "But I didn't expect it to pull in so many cops, clerks, even council members. It's a hydra." Rivera sighed, closing the folder with a soft thud. "Take him down, and the whole thing crumbles. But so does the public's faith in this city. People already think the system's rigged. If this explodes, it'll be gasoline on that fire." Thomas's hands clasped tightly on the table, his knuckles whitening. "So what's your play? Sweep it under the rug? Let them walk free because it's messy?" "No," Rivera shot back, his tone sharp. "But we've got to be surgical about it. Tear this down without a plan to rebuild, and we're begging for Kaosomi. Only worse will slither into the gap." Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the surface. "We can't let fear of what comes next paralyze us," he said fiercely. "They've preyed on people too long. Justice isn't optional here." Rivera held his gaze, then nodded slowly, a grudging respect flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough. But this has to be ironclad, every loose end tied, every angle covered." "I'll get it done," Thomas vowed, the enormity of the task settling onto his shoulders like a mantle. "Whatever it takes." Rivera hesitated, his voice softening. "You've already put yourself and Naomi in the crosshairs. Thomas, you sure you want to keep going?" Thomas's eyes blazed with a fire born of fury and resolve. "They threatened my daughter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't just a case anymore, it's personal." As he left the office that evening, the sky bruising into dusk, his phone buzzed with a text from Naomi. "I'm proud of you. Be safe." The words glowed on the screen, a fleeting balm against the tempest swirling within him. Back home, Naomi waited in the living room, her laptop humming softly on the coffee table, its screen alive with articles and posts tracking the case's ripples. When Thomas stepped inside, she looked up, her face softening with relief. "How'd it go?" she asked, shutting the laptop with a quiet click. He sank onto the couch beside her, the day's weight sloughing off just enough to let him breathe. "It's growing," he said simply, "but we're not stopping." She reached for his hand, her grip firm and warm. "Good," she replied, her voice steady, "because neither am I." In that moment, amid the chaos and the shadows, a quiet truth crystallized. Justice wasn't just a goal, it was a reckoning. And the lesson burned clear in their shared resolve. A power, when twisted and abused, sought its own ruin, they would see it through, not just for themselves, but for every soul the system had failed. The cost was steep, the path perilous, but retreat was no longer an option. Thomas slumped into the chair across from her, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The creak of the old wood beneath him echoed faintly in the dimly lit room, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "River is with us," he said, his voice rough and low, carrying the strain of sleepless nights. "He's on board, but the path ahead stretches out like a treacherous, winding road. He insists on tying up every loose end, locking down every detail before we take another step." Naomi sat opposite him, her brow creasing as worry etched itself into her delicate features. Her dark eyes flickered with unease, reflecting the faint glow of the lamp between them. "Do you think they'll come after you again?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to keep it steady. "They've already tried once, haven't they?" Thomas's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening as memories of past threats flashed through his Minshadai figures. Lurking just out of sight, anonymous calls in the dead of night, the gnawing sense of being watched. "They've tried," he admitted, his tone heavy with a bitterness that had long since settled into his bones. "And they'll try again. But this time we're not caught off guard. We're ready for them." His words hung in the air, sharp and resolute, but Naomi's silence spoke louder. She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve, then leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. The movement brought her closer to him, her face illuminated by the soft light, revealing the storm of emotions brewing beneath her calm exterior. "Dad," she began, her voice softer now, laced with a daughter's quiet fear, "I've been thinking, when this is all over, when we finally put an end to it, what happens to us? What happens to our lives?" Thomas met her gaze, and for a moment, the hard edges of his expression softened. The lines on his face, carved deep by years of struggle, seemed to ease as he looked at her, his daughter, his anchor. "When this is over," he said, his voice gentling like a breeze after a tempest, "we go back to living, not just surviving, Naomi, but really living. Better live zones where you don't have to glance over your shoulder every day, wondering if someone like Greer is lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a question there, unspoken yet heavy, hovering between them like a ghost. Thomas tilted his head, studying her with the keen awareness of a father who knew her better than she sometimes knew herself. "What's on your mind?" he pressed gently, his tone coaxing her to let it out. Naomi bit her lip, her teeth sinking into the soft flesh as she wrestled with her thoughts. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think this will actually make a difference? Or will someone else just step into his place, like weeds growing back after you've pulled them out?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the quiet room. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. His shoulders sagged, not from defeat, but from the burden of a truth he couldn't fully escape. "I don't know," he confessed, his voice raw with honesty. "I can't say for sure, but what I do know is this. If we don't act, if we let this fester, nothing will ever change. And I can't live with that. I won't." His eyes locked onto hers, fierce with determination, and Naomi felt a swell of admiration rise within her. Each word he spoke was a brick laid in the foundation of her respect for him, building it higher with every passing second. "Then we'll see it through together," she said, her voice firm now, a quiet fire igniting behind her words. The days that followed blurred into a whirlwind of relentless motion. Thomas threw himself into the work, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he unraveled the tangled web of corruption. Each new discovery was a thread pulled loose, revealing connections that stretched far beyond what he'd ever imagined, tendrils, reaching into the highest echelons of power, dark and insidious. The evidence piled up, a growing mountain of documents and digital trails that painted a damning picture of Greer's associates, but with every step forward, the danger grew. Anonymous threats sharpened into chilling specific messages detailing his daily routines, his favorite coffee shop, the route he took home. Surveillance tightened around him like a noose. He could feel their eyes on him, unseen but ever present, tracking his every move through the city's crowded streets. One night, long after the world outside had fallen silent, Thomas sat hunched over his desk in the cluttered sanctuary of his home office. The faint hum of his laptop filled the room, its blue glow casting stark shadows across his tired face. Papers littered the desk, scribbled notes, printed emails, maps marked with red ink, each a piece of the puzzle he was desperate to solve. A soft knock broke his focus, and the door creaked open. Naomi stepped inside, her presence cutting through the haze of his concentration like a beam of light. She didn't wait for an invitation, her footsteps deliberate as she crossed the hardwood floor. In her hand, she clutched a small flash drive, its matte black surface glinting faintly in the lamplight. Her expression was grave, her lips set in a tight line, but her eyes burned with a fierce resolve. "I found something," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she carried. She placed the drive on the desk with a quiet thud, stepping back as if to give him space to process what was coming. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he reached for the device. "What kind of something?" he asked, suspicion lacing his words. "Who's involved?" Naomi crossed her arms, her posture rigid with tension. "The kind of people who don't want you digging any deeper," she replied, her tone unwavering but tinged with a daughter's protective worry. "They know you're onto something big, Dad. They're talking about you out there." Thomas plugged the drive into his laptop, his movements methodical despite the unease coiling in his gut. The screen flickered as files loaded, screenshots of shadowy forums, cryptic messages, usernames that meant nothing yet everything. It didn't take long for the truth to emerge. The network was rattled, their carefully constructed empire trembling under the pressure of his investigation. They were gearing up to strike back, and they weren't pulling punches this time. "This is good," Thomas said, though his voice carried no trace of triumphantly a grim acknowledgement of the stakes. "It means they're scared." Naomi stepped closer, her shadow falling across the desk. "It also means they're desperate," she countered, her words sharp with urgency. "And desperate people are dangerous. You need to be careful, Dad." He glanced up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I always am," he said, his eyes drifting back to the screen, already lost in the data. But Naomi wasn't satisfied. She reached out, her hand resting firmly on his shoulder, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I mean it," she insisted, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. "You're not invincible, and he won't lose you." Her words pierced through him, and for a moment, the armor he'd built around himself cracked. He placed his hand over hers, his grip warm and reassuring. "You won't," he promised, his voice soft but resolute. "I swear it." Yet even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. The closer they edged to the truth, the more fragile that promise felt. A thin thread stretched taut against the rising tide of danger. Together, they braced for what lay ahead, their bond forged in the fire of their shared mission. The air grew thick with unspoken fears as the web of corruption began to unravel, each revelation pulling them closer to a reckoning that would test the very core of their beliefs. Thomas knew the final confrontation loomed on the horizon, a storm gathering strength, dark and inevitable. Naomi stood by his side, her determination a mirror to his own, her presence a steadying force amid the chaos. They were in it together, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the fight for justice was a battle with no end in sight, a war against power that corrupted absolutely, leaving devastation in its wake. The tension was palpable days later as Thomas sat across from Rivera in a cramped conference room, the table between them buried under a chaotic sprawl of files. The air smelled of stale coffee and ink, the walls closing in as the sheer magnitude of their task pressed down on them. Each document in the stack was a nail in the coffin of Greer's network, the evidence growing more incriminating with every page. Financial records, coded emails, witness testimonies. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the gnawing sense of unfinished business, a restless itch beneath his skin. Rivera broke the silence, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness. "We're close," he said, his finger tapping nervously on the table, the rhythm erratic from too many late nights and too much caffeine. "But there's a name that keeps surfacing, higher up, someone pulling the strings behind the scenes. We need to pin them down." His eyes, bloodshot and weary, flicked to Thomas, searching for answers. Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles whitened. Greer wasn't just a piece of the puzzle, he said, his voice low and intense. He was a gateway. This network he shielded, it's not some petty local racket. It's a sprawling beast, and if we don't find the head, the whole thing could collapse back into the shadows. Rivera nodded, his face grim, shadows pooling beneath his sharp cheekbones. I've been sifting through bank statements, tracing money trails, he said, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. But if they're clever and they've buried themselves deep. Layers of insulation, shell companies, dead ends. Thomas's lips curled into a bitter smirk. Even the cleverest slip up eventually, he said, his tone edged with defiance. And when they do, we'll be there. The door groaned open, hinges protesting, and Naomi stepped into the room, her sudden presence like a jolt of electricity. She clutched a manila folder, her fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her arrival startled Thomas, grounding him in the midst of the chaos. Naomi, he said, rising from his chair, confusion knitting his brow. What are you doing here? She hesitated, her gaze darting between her father and Rivera, who watched her with quiet curiosity. Then she stepped forward, the folder trembling slightly in her hands. I found something, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy radiating from her. I couldn't wait. Thomas took the folder, his fingers brushing hers as he opened it. Inside, a chaotic collage await printouts of forum threads, grainy screenshots, notes scrawled in her precise handwriting. As he scanned the pages, his expression shifted from puzzlement to dawning realization, a spark igniting in his tired eyes. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice a mix of awe and concern. The weight of her discovery sinking in, Naomi squared her shoulders, her jaw set with determination. I've been digging forums, encrypted channels, places they think no one's looking, she said, her words clipped and purposeful. I found a thread mentioning someone they call the architect. People are terrified of him. They think he's the one orchestrating it all, the puppet master behind the curtain. Rivera leaned forward, his interest sharpening like a blade. The architect, he echoed, his voice low with intrigue. That's a new one on me. Naomi pressed on, her confidence growing. I traced his name back years. Every time someone gets too close to exposing this network, it pops up. Then the trail vanishes like he's a ghost. Thomas's stomach twisted as he flipped through the folder, each page a revelation that deepened the stakes. This isn't just about greed or influence anymore, he murmured, his voice tight with unease. Whoever this architect is, they've engineered a machine to crush anyone who gets in their way, a system built on fear and control. Rivera let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. If he's real, he's the linchpin, he said, his tone heavy with the implications. Take him down, and it all falls apart. Naomi stepped closer, her voice resolute. So what's our move? Thomas closed the folder with a decisive snap, his eyes locking onto hers. We follow the breadcrumbs, he said, his words measured but firm. But we tread lightly. If this architect is as powerful as he seems, he'll have eyes everywhere. Her face tightened, determination flashing in her eyes. I'm not backing off, Dad. Not now. Not after everything. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his touch steadying them both. I know, he said, his voice softening. But we do this my way. Trust me. The room fell silent, the gravity of their next steps settling over them like a shroud. Rivera cleared his throat, shattering the stillness. I'll loop in cyber crimes, he said, standing with a weary stretch. If this guy's hiding in encrypted corners, we'll need their tech to smoke him out. But we keep it tight, no leaks. Thomas nodded. Do it. And watch your back, we can't afford a mole tipping him off. Rivera gave a curt nod and slipped out, leaving father and daughter alone in the fading light. Naomi studied Thomas, her eyes searching his weathered face for reassurance. Do you think we'll get him? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, exhaustion carving deeper lines into his features. If he's out there, we'll find him, he said, his tone resolute despite the weariness. But it's going to be a hell of a fight. She reached for his hand, squeezing it with a strength that belied her slender frame. We've made it this far, she said, her voice steady. We're not stopping now. That night, Thomas sat alone at his desk, the glow of his lamp painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. The folder Naomi had brought lay open before him. Its contents fanned out like a map to an unseen battlefield. He traced a finger along a printed line, his mind racing with possibilities like a thread in the tapestry of corruption they were unraveling. A knock startled him, and Naomi stepped in, her expression hesitant yet resolute. The fight for justice stretched before them, a lesson in the cost of power unchecked, and together, they stood ready to face it, no matter the cost. In the stillness of the night, the air heavy with unspoken fears, Naomi confessed her sleeplessness as she sank into the worn leather chair across from Thomas. Her voice trembled slightly, a fragile thread woven with exhaustion and resolve. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her eyes flickering toward the chaos of papers strewn across his desk, each sheet a testament to their relentless pursuit. Thomas, slouched in his own chair, mirrored her restlessness. "Neither can I," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of too many thoughts pressing against his skull. He leaned back, the creak of the chair punctuating the silence, his mind churning with the stakes they faced. There was so much to consider, too much riding on their next move. Naomi's gaze lingered on the documents, her brow creasing as she traced the edges of a photograph pinned beneath a report. Her fingers hovered there, hesitant, as if touching it might make their suspicions real. "Do you think he knows we're onto him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Laced with a dread she couldn't shake, Thomas paused, his breath catching for a moment as he weighed the question. Then, with a slow nod, he met her eyes. "If he's as connected as we think, he probably does," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water. "But that doesn't mean he knows how close we've gotten." His certainty was a lifeline. Yet Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line, her teeth grazing the soft flesh as she murmured, "What if he comes after us?" The question hung between them, fragile and sharp, a blade glinting in the dim light. Thomas reached across the desk, his calloused hand enveloping hers with a warmth that steadied her trembling fingers. "Then we'll be ready," he vowed, his voice firm, a shield against the shadows creeping into her thoughts. "I won't let anything happen to you." "Naomi." "Not ever," she nodded, wanting to believe him, but the fear lingered in her chest, a cold knot that refused to unravel. Her hazel eyes, wide and searching, met his, and though she drew strength from his grip, she couldn't silence the deeper worry gnawing at her. "I trust you," she said softly, "but it's not just about us, Dad. It's about everyone he's crushed under his heel. If we don't stop him, no one will." Her words carried a quiet fire, a spark of defiance flickering beneath her fear. Thomas squeezed her hand tighter, pride swelling in his chest like a tide, threatening to spill over. "You're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's exactly why we can't give up now." The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky pressing down on the city as Thomas and Rivera stepped into the sterile hum of the FBI's secure room. The air buzzed with the low drone of computers, a symphony of clicking keys and whirring fans as the cybercrimes team hunched over their screens. Streams of data cascaded across monitors, lines of code, timestamps, encrypted message, so fragments of a puzzle they'd spent months piecing together. Thomas stood near the center of the room, his arms crossed, his pulses steady thrum in his ears as he watched the analysts work. Rivera, his partner of 5 years, stood beside him, his sharp jaw set, his dark eyes scanning the screens with a predator's focus. They'd come too far to falter now. "We've got something," an analyst named Jenkins called out, spinning in his chair to face them. His glasses caught the glow of the monitor, reflecting a grid of numbers and coordinates, a recurring IP address tied to encrypted communications. "It's bouncing through multiple proxies: Russia, Singapore, a dozen other places, but we're narrowing it down." Thomas leaned forward, his heart kicking against his ribs like a caged animal. "How close are we?" he asked, his voice rough with urgency. Jenkins grinned, a flicker of triumph breaking through his exhaustion. "Close," he said. "Give me another hour." The promise hung in the air, electric and tantalizing, as the room seemed to pulse with renewed energy. Rivera turned to Thomas, his expression carved from stone, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of anticipation. "This is it," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. If we find him, everything changes. Thomas nodded, his mind already racing ahead, mapping out the confrontation he'd imagined 1,000 times. We will, he said, his tone ironclad. And when we do, he won't even see us coming. The minutes crawled by, each tick of the clock a hammer striking an anvil, the tension in the room thickening until it was almost suffocating. Thomas paced near the window, his boots scuffing the linoleum, while Rivera stood statue still, his hands clasped behind his back. Finally, Jenkins broke the silence, his voice cutting through the haze like a blade. "We've got a location," he said, steady but urgent, pointing to a pin on the digital map glowing on his screen. Thomas and Rivera locked eyes, a wordless pact passing between them. The hunt wasn't over, but the finish line shimmered on the horizon. What followed unfolded like a fever dream, a blur of motion and adrenaline that felt both eternal and fleeting. The IP led them to a squat, unassuming office building nestled in the city's heart, a concrete box swallowed by the skyline, its faded sign blending into the urban sprawl. To the untrained eye, it was nothing special, just another faceless structure drowning in the hum of traffic and neon. But as Thomas and Rivera led a tactical team through its glass doors, the air crackled with the weight of what lay inside. They moved with precision, boots silent on the carpeted stairs, weapons drawn, their breaths synchronized as they ascended to the top floor. The breach was swift, a flash of steel, a splintered lock, and then they were in. The sterile glow of fluorescent lights illuminating a scene no one had anticipated. There, standing behind a polished desk littered with files and a steaming mug of coffee, was Captain Raymond Blackwell, Greer's longtime superior. His tailored suit hugged his broad frame, his silver hair swept back with meticulous care, and his calm, almost bored expression stood in stark contrast to the chaos erupting around him. Armed agents fanned out, their shouts echoing off the walls, but Blackwell didn't flinch. "You finally made it," he said, his voice smooth as polished glass, unshaken even as rifles trained on his chest. "I was wondering how long it'd take you." Thomas stepped forward, his face a mask of ice, though fury simmered beneath his skin. "You've been the one pulling the strings," he said, each word a shard of steel. "Greer was just your puppet." Blackwell tilted his head, a faint smirk curling his lips, as if amused by the accusation. "Greer was useful," he admitted, his tone casual, almost dismissive. "A blunt instrument, sure, but effective when wielded right. He kept the spotlight off me while I handled the real business." Thomas's fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening as weeks of rage threatened to erupt. "The real business," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You mean the corruption, the extortion, the lives you've shattered." Blackwell shrugged, his nonchalance a slap in the face. "You call it corruption, I call it efficiency," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The world's not black and white, Carter. Sometimes you sacrifice a few pawns for the greater good." Thomas took another step, closing the distance, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Don't you dare lecture me about sacrifices. You've spent your career twisting the system, breaking people to prop up your throne. That stops today." Blackwell's smirk faded, replaced by a glacial stare that bored into Thomas. "You think this ends with me?" he said, his tone darkening. "You think dragging me down will fix everything? You're naive, Carter. This machine's bigger than any one man." Thomas didn't waver, his resolve a steel beam in a storm. "Maybe," he shot back, "but every machine has a flaw, and today that's you." Rivera signaled the agents, and they surged forward, cuffing Blackwell's wrists with a satisfying click. As they hauled him away, his parting words slithered through the air like smoke. "You've won this round, Carter, but the war's just begun." The aftermath was seismic. Blackwell's arrest sent tremors through the city, the news spreading like wildfire across every screen and headline. The evidence seized from that unremarkable officio labyrinth of bank records, coded messages, and payoffs unraveled a sprawling web of corruption that reached into the highest echelons. Dozens fell in the weeks that followed, council members, police brass, even a judge who'd once presided over Greer's cases with a wink and a gavel. Thomas and Naomi stood side by side as the world learned the truth, the crushing weight of their fight finally easing from their shoulders. They'd struck a blow against a beast that fed on silence and fear. And though the battle wasn't over, the victory tasted sweet. For Naomi, the journey had forged her anew. What began as a wound draw and humiliating had hardened into a core of steel. She threw herself into advocacy, her voice rising above the din. A beacon for those the system had discarded. Her courage rippled outward, igniting sparks of defiance in others. Her story a testament to resilience born from ruin. Thomas watched her with quiet awe, his chest swelling with a pride deeper than any badge could offer. "You did it, Dad," she said one evening, her eyes gleaming as they stood on their porch, the city sprawling below. "You didn't just fight for May, you fought for everyone." He smiled, a rare, unguarded grin breaking through his weariness. "We did it, Naomi, together." Thomas's own path shifted too. His name echoed through the FBI's halls. But the praise meant little compared to the difference he'd made not just for Naomi, but for every soul the system had betrayed. He took a new role, one rooted in reform, a vow to hold the law accountable from within. It was a grueling road, lined with resistance and ghosts of the past, but he walked it with his head high. Greer, stripped bare of his swagger and cronies, faced a trial that ended in a cell. His once proud frame diminished, his arrogance drowned by the consequences he'd sown. Blackwell's fate was no lighter. Justice claimed him too, though his final taunt lingered in Thomas's mind, a whisper of doubt amid the triumph. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, Thomas and Naomi sat together on their porch. The city hummed below, alive and uncertain, but for the first time in months, they let themselves breathe. The future stretched before them, vast and uncharted, yet they faced it with a quiet hope forged in fire. Thomas turned to his daughter, his voice soft against the evening breeze. "I used to think my job was to shield you from the world," he said, his eyes tracing the skyline. "But you've taught me that real strength is standing up to it." Naomi smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, her warmth a steady anchor. "And you've shown me that no matter how towering the fight, it's always worth it." Their story was a jagged mirror, reflecting the cost of power unchecked and the beauty of justice reclaimed. Blackwell and Greer had wielded authority like a weapon, carving scars into the lives they swore to protect. But their fall proved a timeless truth. No empire built on exploitation endures forever. Thomas and Naomi had exposed the rot, not with brute force, but with a relentless pursuit of what was right, a lesson etched in every step of their journey. The system might loom larger than any one soul, but it could be challenged, reshaped, made to answer for its sins. And in that truth, they found not just victory, but purpose.